Hi, I'm Robbie Stewart, a graduate from Carleton University's paleontology program, and today we're going to be talking about Cenozoic crocodiles. Besides China and the Americas, for the rest of the Cenozoic, after the decline of the alligatoroids, the river systems have been haunted by the true crocodiles, crocodilians that evolved very, very recently. We often think of true crocodiles as being ancient and prehistoric and unchanging throughout the eons, but the first true crocodiles actually only evolved 15 million years ago, long after so many of their more ancient relatives had gone into decline. True crocodiles actually evolved after whales and bats, and at the same time as creatures like cats and goats, including us. We primates actually took off as a family before crocodilians started to evolve into true crocodiles. And around the same time that the earliest human ancestors were coming down from the trees, crocodiles were evolving in the water systems to eat them. We have evolved in tandem with one another. They have spread through the continents around the same times and at the same pace that we have. Not following us, but traveling similar systems of transportation in order to reach the places they wanted to go, following rivers just as we did, because we both depend upon water. Instead, they're so recent that they adapted to mammals as prey. The giant rhino-eating crocodile from our very first video on crocodilians is a perfect example. Cenozoic, the first of the sauropod-sized rhinos to truly get massive, spent its entire existence as a genus without ever encountering the giant crocodiles, and its successor, the even larger Cenozoic, lived a full 7 million years before its predators would evolve. Cenozoic, the giant crocodilian that was probably the one preying on them, lived and died along with them. When they went extinct, so did it. And yet, they were able to exist before the crocodiles did, just as we primates existed before crocodiles did, at least crocodiles as we understand them. Like humans, the cradle of crocodile evolution was Africa, although while we enjoyed the jungles of Africa as a place for our evolution, the crocodiles were taking advantage of the shrinking Tethys Ocean that was getting smaller with every passing million years. As the ocean shrunk, it was getting squeezed, and mangrove swamps and complex river systems were branching out as a result of the compression that was happening to this ocean. At around the same time that monkeys were replacing lemurs as the dominant tree-dwelling animals in Africa, crocodiles were beginning to evolve to replace the gavialoids as the dominant water predators of Africa. They evolved alongside elephants that were about the size of cows, creatures that we covered in an earlier video who were semi-aquatic and would have been good targets for these crocodiles as they were evolving. During this evolutionary radiation, crocodiles started to evolve into the familiar forms that we know today. Even though the family is very recent, many of the family members have hung around for millions of years afterwards. The Nile crocodile and the African dwarf crocodile are both 11 million years old, which makes them very old by genera standards, about as old as the American alligator. But even as this was happening, they were also spreading all across the world. First, they spread into West Africa in the form of Crocodilus chechii, which would eventually give rise to the West African crocodile that we know today. But in addition, crocodiles would actually swim all the way up to India, even in this short million-year time span, with Crocodilus paleoindicus becoming the ancestor of the modern-day mugger crocodile. There, they encountered more gavialoids, just like the alligatoroids were doing on the other side of the world. Gavialoids that were swimming up into the subcontinent from the Indian Ocean. These gavialoids grew to truly stunning sizes. Maybe the biggest gavialoid to ever live, Ramphosuchus, was an 11-meter-long predator. Another Asian gavialoid, Hanyusuchus, survived all the way into modern times, only going extinct about 500 years ago. But having a thin snout like this doesn't necessarily mean that it was only eating fish. Another gavialoid, descended from relatives of Toyotamphemia that swam all the way up to the rivers of China and survived into human times, leaves behind a record suggesting that gavialoids didn't only prey on fish historically. Hanyusucus was so named for a governor from the Tang dynasty in China, who served these crocodilians an eviction notice. The eviction notice claimed that they were preying on humans and goats, and it was unacceptable behavior, so they had to abide by the law and leave, or they would be executed. The Gavialoids, of course, gave no notice, and so were rounded up and killed by Tang dynasty soldiers. This recorded incident is only one in a long history that the Chinese experienced coming into conflict with this ancient crocodile. Bones from Hanyusucus sometimes show marks where they were cut by human weapons. But the early Chinese had good reason to be targeting Hanyusucus. A 10-year-old child named Zhang was killed by one of these crocodiles, and the Gavialoids were rounded up and executed, with their crimes being announced to the general populace. Elsewhere in China, moats were filled up with Hanyusucus, and apparently were used to execute prisoners and defend against invading armies. Clearly, Hanyusucus was capable of taking on bigger prey than just fish, despite its narrow snout. Eventually, the Ming dynasty decided that after centuries of conflict between humans and crocodilians, they were going to make a concerted effort to exterminate this giant Gavialoid. And in 1400 AD, they succeeded, which is why we don't have any of them left today. With such a long and storied history of Hanyusucus attacking livestock and people, and some fossil records suggesting that its Japanese relative Toyota Mefimia might have done the same, it's not a stretch to suggest that Ramphosuchus, an even bigger relative, may have been attacking river dolphins and even prehistoric apes like Civipithecus as they were coming down to the waters to drink. Ramphosuchus is known only from the tip of a single snout, but that snout is so big that it's the same size as the skull of an entire gavial. Whatever they were eating, these Gavialoids would be mingling with the ancestors of mugger crocodiles, and records of Hanyusucus suggest that the Chinese were able to see it coexisting alongside Chinese alligators, which we still have today. Further to the south, we have examples that survive to the modern day of mugger crocodiles coexisting with modern gavials, as well as Siamese crocodiles coexisting with false gavials today. Even to this very day, Gavialoids will coexist with modern-day crocodiles. Mugger crocodiles and gharials intermingle in India's river systems, and further south, the extremely critically endangered Siamese crocodile is sometimes found alongside the equally endangered false gharial. Unlike Hanyusucus's tragic, if understandable, targeted extermination campaign, these creatures are simply casualties of humans expanding into their habitat, just like the Chinese alligators were. And so sadly, these days, these two different species of crocodilian are more likely to meet at a zoo or a rescue than in their natural habitat in the rivers of Siam. But the greatest intermingling of the three surviving crocodile clans would come in those nutrient-rich rivers in South America that we described. Swimming in from West Africa, a crocodilian called Crocodilus would end up sharing the waters alongside the gigantic caimans Perusaurus and Morisuchus and the gigantic gharial Gryposuchus. Unlike in Asia, where you sometimes find crocodiles alongside gavials or alligatoroids alongside Hanyusucus, in this case all three species were living in the exact same habitat at the exact same time. We find their bones in the same deposits of Venezuela to this very day. In addition, we had their cousins the Cebesids wandering along the riversides, and we also find their bones in the same formations. Creatures like Langstonia were prowling the riversides at the same time that the three groups of crocodilians were swimming through them, distant cousins of theirs who had also survived to this new era. It was the height of crocodilian diversity, the greatest success that the wider crocodile family had enjoyed since the Cretaceous of Africa, some 100 million years earlier. Of course, it didn't last. The only South American crocodile at the time went extinct alongside the giant caimans, Gavialoids, and Cebesids when South America was suddenly cooled by the formation of the rising Andes and the changing of the river systems. Over in Africa, the Gavialoids actually never managed to penetrate deep into the river systems for whatever reason. So unlike in Asia and in South America, there was no period of coexistence between Gavialoids swimming up the rivers from the oceans and crocodiles that were spreading through the different river systems out from Africa. Instead, a true crocodile evolved to look and act like a gavialoid. The strange-looking giant crocodile Euthecodon evolved to live and act like a giant gavialoid. But unlike the gavialoids, Euthecodon had these strange sheaths guarding each one of its teeth, which gave it this distinctive sawtoothed appearance unlike the giant gavialoids that were living in river systems opposite it. But the relative isolation of Africa also proved a boon for Euthecodon, who survived the extinction events that ended up wiping out Ramphosuchus and Gryposuchus because of cooling and tectonic events. In the heart of Africa, Euthecodon survived to coexist even with our ancestors. While we were learning to walk upright, these gigantic fish-catching crocodiles were swimming through the river systems, same ones that we depended on for water. While it may have looked very different from Gryposuchus and Ramphosuchus, with those strange bone notches surrounding its teeth, it actually lived very similarly to them, growing to similar sizes too. At an impressive 10 meters long, this giant was one of the largest animals alive in Africa at the time. But unlike Ramphosuchus and Gryposuchus, who went extinct due to cooling events and the changing and shuffling of the river systems, deep in the heart of Africa, Euthecodon was able to hang on just fine. Euthecodon survived all the way up until the very coldest periods of the ice ages started to settle in, a mere 800,000 years ago. By that time, modern humans had already evolved, and it's quite likely that our earliest ancestors were interacting with these gigantic crocodiles on a regular basis. Unlike the gavialoids, the specialized teeth of Euthecodon mean it probably didn't pose a major threat to our ancestors. And it's a good thing, too, because we had our fair share of crocodilians to deal with already. Remember, true crocodiles evolved alongside mammals, and this was true of our ancestors, too. A gigantic dwarf crocodile the size of a modern alligator called Brocucus evolved alongside some of the very earliest ape species called proconsul. And even after Brocucus went extinct, Nile crocodiles evolved not long after. Even to this day, Nile crocodiles are infamous for preying on humans, with quasi-mythical examples like Gustav killing as many as 100 people, maybe even thousands. But even older and bigger crocodile species were also preying on our ancestors. Just like we have evidence of crocodilians attacking terror birds and giant rhinos in the form of teeth embedded in a terror bird femur and bite marks on the giant rhino skeletons, we also have tooth marks on the bones of early hominids that came from giant crocodiles. Crocodilus anthropophagus, alongside an equally gigantic sister species that lived at the same time, probably evolved to prey on giant elephants like Dinotherium, which we discussed in our elephant video, as well as these gigantic, strange moose-like giraffe called Civatherium. These crocodilians were different from Nile crocodiles, not just in the fact that they were bigger, but Crocodilus anthropophagus also sported a pair of prominent horns, just like Ceratasuchus the alligatorid from the Eocene did. At the same time this was happening, another species of horned crocodile called Voi had swum to the island of Madagascar, and just like its other primate-eating cousins, was causing havoc for the giant lemurs living there. Even to this day, the modern Cuban crocodile is famed for its aggression, and while this is likely a coincidence, it seems that horned crocodiles, for whatever reason, seem to particularly target primates. It's thought that these horns repeatedly evolved on crocodilians as a way to establish dominance amongst males. Sexual selection, similar to moose antlers or rhino horns. Whoever had the largest set of horns over its brow was the biggest and toughest of the crocodiles. Although why exactly horned crocodiles in particular seem to have such a bad relationship with humans is a mystery, and probably just a coincidence, less mysterious is why these giant horned crocodiles went extinct. Just like Euthecodon, they couldn't handle the ice ages, which turned Africa to a much colder and drier place and shrunk the rivers that they depended upon for food. But even as these crocodiles went extinct, the Nile crocodile only became more successful and started to spread out across the rivers of Africa and all over the world. Following in the footsteps of Crocodilus, Nile crocodiles on West Africa's coast made it all the way to Venezuela, and then from there went as far north as Florida. At the same time that this was happening, Nile crocodiles that had started a journey across Asia made their way all the way down to Australia. And so these ancient, unchanging animals ended up reaching one of the furthest points south in the world a mere 10,000 years ago, around the same time that human culture was starting to develop. We actually got to meet some of these crocodiles that traveled all the way down to Australia when we visited Little Rays earlier in the year. We found a particularly hungry saltwater crocodile who thought that maybe we might be part of its next meal. Let's check in on him now. There we go. Whew, that was a jump.
So the funny thing is, this is a small alligator crocodile.
Yeah.
It's maybe 9.5, 10 feet long. And this is the size for zookeepers that are most dangerous to deal with, because they're still super agile and can move very, very quickly. When they get really big, if they get you, you're in a lot of trouble. But they're not fast like this.
Yeah.
So you gotta always be super careful. And she's obviously super hungry, so I'll have to toss some food for her and give it to her later, because I hate teasing her.
Some of these ancestral crocodiles may have even followed our ancestors as they were spreading out of Africa. Humans have always needed water, and crocodiles have been all too happy to exploit animals that need a drink. We've always had a primordial fear of crocodiles and of something lurking in the river systems, something that probably dates back to our ancestors being preyed upon by crocodiles. But today, opinions about crocodiles are changing, and more people are starting to view them with respect. Crocodiles and their family are better understood, and it's known that most crocodile species are actually harmless to humans. Even ones that are particularly aggressive, like the Cuban crocodile, aren't actually dangerous towards people unless they confront them. And some crocodilians, like the freshwater crocodile, almost every species of caiman, and the gavial, will all run away when confronted with people. There's only a very few species that are actually dangerous towards humans. Even the most dangerous crocodilians oftentimes are no more dangerous to people than dogs or wolves, even in places where crocodiles come into contact with people about as frequently as dogs do. We've also come to recognize our responsibility in wiping out many of the crocodilian species that almost made it to the modern day. The Mecosoukians like Quincana and Trilophosuchus that were able to walk on land, the ocean-going crocodiles like Echanogavialis, and even the more modern historic extinctions, like Voi going extinct when humans reached Madagascar, or Hanusuchus going extinct as recently as 600 years ago. And so, particularly passionate humans have stopped hunting down crocodiles and turned to saving them, as we've realized that these animals are precious and that we have a responsibility to coexist with them, something that our ancestors couldn't afford to do, but now in the modern day, we as a species have matured enough to be able to do safely, reasonably, and effectively. In some cases, humans are the only thing that are standing between crocodilians like the gavial, the Siamese crocodile, and the Chinese alligator and extinction. And as we've come into contact with them in captivity more, we've learned that they're some of the most intelligent species of reptile, being about as intelligent as rats or dogs. We've learned that they're capable of using tools, learning routines, and even capable of complex social behaviors. We've learned that they're caring parents who will raise their young, sometimes just the mother, but sometimes the father as well. Do crocodiles feel love? Maybe. They certainly are willing to raise their families. But more importantly, these ancient creatures that have existed are not static, stupid, dull, lazy, or prehistoric. They're adapting and living alongside us right now. And right now, more than any primordial adaptation that crocodiles might have that let them live forever, what they need most is our help to survive. Crocodilians have been most successful in places where they've learned to coexist with humans, like the alligators of Florida or the saltwater crocodiles of Australia. Humans and crocodiles have very complicated relationships there. We hunt them for their meat, we harvest them for their leather, but we also accept that they are dangerous, and sometimes they'll attack us back. But in some places, human beings are all that's standing between crocodiles and extinction. Who knows? Maybe someday one of you will be one of the people who saves a crocodile species and makes it so that these crocodiles survive not just the age of the dinosaurs, not just the age of mammals, but into whatever the future holds for this incredible group of truly ancient animals.